And welcome back. And as many of you pointing out, a very somber discussion taking place at the moment. And we're talking about the brutal murder of George Floyd and the lived reality of black people since time immemorial. And we're talking about black lives and whether they actually do matter, given how we respond to acts of brutality and killings against black people. And of course, the Pan-African Bar Association of South Africa have also penned a piece here entitled Justice for George Floyd, and PABASA saying that the pain of black Americans is as real to black South Africans because of the perpetual racism visited against black South Africans. And we have with us this morning, of course, from PABASA, Advocate Moses Kakane and a political analyst, Advocate Goko Obri Mashitri, talking to us about these matters. So before the break, we were talking about the Collin Khosa case and the fact that those who are alleged to have perpetrated his killing have been vindicated. And Aubrey, I paused you mid-sentence there just to actually go to news, but just to pick up on the Collin Khosa issue and the fact that the military report was then again also a subject of discussion in Parliament, and the DA basically calling out the minister, asking whether she was undermined by the military, by the Defence Force, whether she actually did not know that she had signed off on that document, basically vindicating the alleged perpetrators, or what actually happened there. So if you could just pick up on that point first.
Well, Sakina, there are only two possibilities in that regard. Either the minister lied to the nation, or the minister was undermined by the military in how it went about doing the investigation and with regard to the conclusions it came to, and then came to the further conclusion that the matter was closed. So on Friday is President Ramaphosa saying for him the matter is not closed and those soldiers must face the full might of the law. The problem, Sakina, we have faced, and this is a pathology of politics, is the gap between words and what they describe. For instance, the word stone is not a stone. And many of the words that are uttered by our politicians, particularly from the ruling party, including the president, is precisely that there is a gap between what those words describe, what those words describe, and the words themselves. And therefore, the challenge with regard to how the post-apartheid state and the ruling party will proceed from this moment on must be with regard to making a commitment to bridging their words and what those words describe.
Advocates Kakane, is that possible, given the lived reality of black South Africans under a democratic dispensation that is led by a black party, as it were, in the ANC, given what we've seen with Collin Khosa? Because the irony is not lost upon one that there was no grand statement, there was no grand launch of a campaign marking the death of Collin Khosa, but there was one for the death of George Floyd. What are we supposed to make of that? What are we supposed to read into that as South Africans?
Well, I think it's what I was saying to you, Sakin, is that we have to understand that historically, white supremacy is brutal. Its perpetrators are brutal and violent. Its effect on us is devastating. And therefore, what you see is actually the effect of that devastating nature of internalized racism, of seeing yourself as of less value than other races. And I think, this is not an insult. It's a reality that we must confront honestly, because if we don't confront the issue of the lived experiences of the black person all over the world, South Africa in particular, we're standing at the doorstep of a revolt that will be an explosion of years and centuries of boiled and bottled up anger that has been passed on from generation to generation. And when we see it, because we're sitting in what I call the perfect storm of injustice and inequality, and we're sitting in this false rainbow nation whose reconciliation happened at the expense of blackness, at the expense of the black experience and their lives and freedom. And if we don't confront that, and particularly the ANC, which is the liberation movement, it has to confront it head on. I think the EFF confronted it better, if one has to be honest. And I think we need to really look at ourselves and whether we've not abandoned the historical mission of the anti-apartheid struggle, because we've become political. There are political contestations that have taken center stage.
But one could argue that this is happening with the tacit approval of the electorate of the South African public, of which the majority are Black South Africans, because this is something that the South African public seems to swallow time and time again, for lack of a better phrase, Advocate Skakane.
They swallow it exactly because, as I told you, white supremacy affects us because it also convinces us that we are somewhat epistemologically inferior. We believe that ourselves about ourselves. And so you shouldn't be surprised that a majority country, a country with Black people, look at themselves as inferior. It's because that's what the system has taught us. And it doesn't matter that we are freedom fighters. It doesn't matter that we are Black politicians. The fact of the matter is that we've lost the debate about race, because the discourse on race also happens in a manner that we want to debate it in such a way that our white counterparts feel comfortable. And my suggestion is that we must look at the brutality of racism and the lived experience of a Black person with no regard to white sensibilities, if we are to be honest, and deal with what we've been going through for centuries without worrying about what our white counterparts feel.
Why haven't Black South Africans, at the very least, Aubrey, done that to this point? Because it's not like people don't have agency. These are the very same people. This is the very same nation that confronted apartheid.
Well, Sakina, I was about to make that point exactly, that we must not be misunderstood to be suggesting that Black people are bereft completely of any sense of agency. But you raise an important question about the behavior of the electorate that keeps us voting for the same party. The same party, as I said to some extent, passes policies, particularly economic policies, that are objectively anti-poor, objectively anti-Black, and most importantly, objectively anti-Black women, because Black women are the face of poverty, inequality, and unemployment, and therefore bear the brunt of the global colonialities and apartheid colonialism and the ravages of those pathologies that are still with us today. But this brings us to another point, Sakina. What is the true nature of liberal democracy? Because ours is not just a democracy, it's a liberal democracy that is tied to capitalism. And what that means for me is that to some extent, democracy, liberal democracy, to some extent, which was already in crisis in parts of Europe and in the United States prior to the onset of COVID-19, is a project that is failing. It is failing millions of people, billions of people around the so-called developed world and in our country, precisely because liberal democracy is a story. It's not a lived experience. And again, in liberal democracy, you see the problem I was talking about, the gap between words and what they describe. So election after election, there is no connection in this country between elections or voting on the one hand and the lived reality and therefore outcomes on the other. which means every time a Black person votes in this country, a Black person is voting for his or her disenfranchisement, particularly economic disenfranchisement.
We are out of time, but I have to ask both of you, what would need to happen to demonstrate that the authorities, the government of the day, actually believes that Black lives do matter? Advocate Skakane first.
Sakina, we must confront head-on the ravages of apartheid and colonialism, the landlessness, the poverty, the dehumanizing poverty that Black people live under. Because if we don't, our people will revolt against some of our good structures. If we don't, we will confirm the belief that we are a Black government running a Black country on behalf of white interests and white capital.
Gogo Mashite?
Well, globally, Black people must organize to attack and destroy coloniality at a global level. In this country, we must be honest about the fact that South Africa does not belong to all who live in it, not yet. South Africa belongs to those who conquered it. And we must mobilize and we must attack that reality and destroy that reality so that South Africa can belong to all who live in it at some point in future. And when that happens, Black lives will matter.
Well, thanks, gentlemen. Advocate Muzi Skakane from PABASA, an association of advocates, and political analyst Gogo Obri Mashitli for talking to us about juxtaposing the U.S. case of George Floyd, who died at the hands of police, and the local case of Collin Khosa, who was allegedly killed by the South African State Army, and responding to the question of Black lives and whether they actually do matter. Let's take a break.